Objections to evolution have been raised since evolutionary ideas came to prominence in the 19th century. When Charles Darwin published his 1859 book on the origin of species, his theory of evolution, the idea that species arose through descent with modification from a single common ancestor in a process driven by natural selection, initially met opposition from scientists with different theories, but came to be overwhelmingly accepted by the scientific community. The observation of evolutionary processes occurring has been uncontroversial among mainstream biologists for nearly a century and remains so today. Since then, most criticisms and denials of evolution have come from religious sources, rather than from the scientific community. Although many religions have accepted the occurrence of evolution, such as those advocating theistic evolution, there are some religious beliefs which reject evolutionary explanations in favor of creationism. The belief that a deity supernaturally created the world largely in its current form. The resultant US-centered creation-evolution controversy has been a focal point of recent conflict between religion and science. Modern creationism is characterized by movements such as creation science, neo-creationism, and intelligent design, which argue that the idea of life being directly designed by a god or intelligence is at least as scientific as evolutionary theory, and should therefore be taught in public education. Such arguments against evolution have become widespread and include objections to evolution's evidence, methodology, plausibility, morality, and scientific acceptance. The scientific community, however, does not recognize such objections as valid, citing detractors' misinterpretations of such things as the scientific method, evidence, and basic physical laws. History. Various evolutionary ideas came to prominence around the start of the 19th century. In particular, the transmutation of species theory put forward by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. These were opposed on scientific grounds, most notably by Georges Cuvier, as well as encountering political and religious objections. These ideas that natural laws control the development of nature and society gained vast popular audiences with George Combs' The Constitution of Man of 1828 and the anonymous vestiges of the Natural History of Creation of 1844. When Charles Darwin published his 1859 book on the origin of species, he convinced most of the scientific community that new species arose through descent through modification in a branching pattern of divergence from common ancestors. But while most scientists accepted that natural selection was a valid and empirically testable hypothesis, Darwin's view that it was the primary mechanism of evolution was generally rejected. The earliest objections to Darwinian evolution were both scientific and religious. Darwin's contemporaries eventually came to accept the transmutation of species based upon fossil evidence. The X Club was formed to defend evolution against the church and wealthy amateurs. Although the specific evolutionary mechanism which Darwin provided, natural selection, was actively disputed in favor of alternative theories such as Lamarckism and orthogenesis. Darwin's gradualistic account was also opposed by saltationism and catastrophism. Lord Kelvin led scientific opposition to gradualism on the basis of his thermodynamic calculations that the Earth was between 24 and 400 million years old, an estimate strongly disputed by geologists. These figures were corrected in 1907 when radioactive dating of rocks showed that the Earth was billions of years old. Kelvin's own views favored a version of theistic evolution accelerated by divine guidance. The specific hereditary mechanism Darwin provided, pangenesis, lacked any supporting evidence. Although evolution was unchallenged, uncertainties about the mechanism in the eclipse of Darwinism persisted from the 1880s until the 1930s. Inclusion of Mendelian inheritance and the rise of the modern evolutionary synthesis. The modern synthesis rose to universal acceptance among biologists with the help of new evidence, such as genetics, which confirmed Darwin's predictions and refuted the competing theories. Protestantism, especially in America, broke out in acrid polemics and argument about evolution from 1860 to the 1870s, with the turning point possibly marked by the death of Louis Agassiz in 1873, and by 1880 a form of Christian evolution was becoming the consensus. In Britain, while publication of The Descent of Man by Darwin in 1871 reinvigorated debate from the previous decade, Sir Henry Chadwick notes a steady acceptance of evolution among more educated Christians between 1860 and 1885. As a result, evolutionary theory was both permissible and respectable. By 1876, Frederick Temple's lectures on the relations between religion and science on how evolution was not antagonistic to religion highlighted this trend. Temple's appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1896 demonstrated the broad acceptance of evolution within the church hierarchy. For decades, the Roman Catholic Church avoided official refutation of evolution. However, it would rein in Catholics who proposed that evolution could be reconciled with the Bible, as this conflicted with the First Vatican Council's finding that everything was created out of nothing by God, and to deny that finding could lead to excommunication. In 1950, the encyclical Humani Generis of Pope Pius XII first mentioned evolution directly and officially. It allowed one to inquire into the concept of humans coming from pre-existing living matter, but not to question Adam and Eve or the creation of the soul. In 1996, Pope John Paul II said that evolution was more than a hypothesis, and acknowledged the large body of work accumulated in its support, but reiterated that any attempt to give a material explanation of the human soul was incompatible with the truth about man. Muslim reaction ranged from those believing in literal creation from the Quran to many educated Muslims who subscribed to a version of theistic or guided evolution in which the Quran reinforced rather than contradicted mainstream science. This occurred relatively early, as medieval madrasas taught the ideas of Al-Jahiz, a Muslim scholar from the 9th century, who proposed concepts similar to natural selection. However, acceptance of evolution remains low in the Muslim world, as prominent figures reject evolution's underpinning philosophy of materialism as unsound to human origins and a denial of Allah. Further objections by Muslim authors and writers largely reflect those put forward in the Western world. Regardless of acceptance from major religious hierarchies, early religious objections to Darwin's theory are still used in opposition to evolution. The ideas that species change over time through natural processes and that different species share common ancestors seem to contradict the Genesis account of creation. Believers in biblical infallibility attack Darwinism as heretical. The natural theology of the early 19th century was typified by William Paley's watchmaker analogy, an argument from design still used by the creationist movement. Natural theology included a range of ideas and arguments from the outset, and when Darwin's theory was published, ideas of theistic evolution were presented in which evolution is accepted as a secondary cause open to scientific investigation, while still holding belief in God as a first cause with a non-specified role in guiding evolution and creating humans. This position has been adopted by denominations of Christianity and Judaism in line with modernist theology, which views the Bible and Torah as allegorical, thus removing the conflict between evolution and religion. However, in the 1920s, Christian fundamentalists in the United States developed their literalist arguments against modernist theology into opposition to the teaching of evolution, with fears that Darwinism had led to German militarism and was a threat to religion and morality. This opposition developed into the creation-evolution controversy involving Christian literalists in the United States objecting to the teaching of evolution in public schools. Although early objectors dismissed evolution as contradicting their interpretation of the Bible, this argument was legally invalidated when the Supreme Court ruled in Epperson v. Arkansas in 1968 that forbidding the teaching of evolution on religious grounds violated the Establishment Clause. Since then, creationists have developed more nuanced objections to evolution, alleging variously that it is unscientific, infringes on creationists' religious freedoms, or that the acceptance of evolution is a religious stance. Creationists have appealed to democratic principles of fairness, arguing that evolution is controversial, and that science classrooms should therefore teach the controversy. These objections to evolution culminated in the intelligent design movement in the 1990s and early 2000s that unsuccessfully attempted to present itself as a scientific alternative to evolution. Defining evolution. One of the main sources of confusion and ambiguity in the creation-evolution debate is the definition of evolution itself. In the context of biology, evolution is genetic changes in populations of organisms over successive generations. However, the word has a number of different meanings in different fields. From evolutionary computation to molecular evolution to socio-cultural evolution to stellar and galactic evolution. It can even refer to metaphysical evolution, spiritual evolution, or any of a number of evolutionist philosophies. When biological evolution is conflated with other evolutionary processes, this can cause errors such as the claim that modern evolutionary theory says anything about abiogenesis or the Big Bang. In colloquial contexts, evolution can refer to any sort of progressive development, and often bears a connotation of gradual improvement. Here evolution is understood as a process that results in greater quality or complexity. This common definition, when misapplied to biological evolution, leads to frequent misunderstandings. For example, the idea of devolution is a result of erroneously assuming that evolution is directional or has a specific goal in mind. In reality, the evolution of an organism has no objective other than increasing the organism's ability to survive and reproduce in its environment, and its suitability is only defined in relation to this environment. Biologists do not consider any one species, such as humans, to be more highly evolved or advanced than another. Certain sources have been criticized for indicating otherwise due to a tendency to evaluate non-human organisms according to anthropocentric standards, rather than more objective ones. Evolution also does not require that organisms become more complex. Although the history of life shows an apparent trend towards the evolution of biological complexity, there is a question if this appearance of increased complexity is real, or if this conclusion comes from neglecting the fact that the majority of life on Earth has always consisted of prokaryotes. In this view, complexity is not a necessary consequence of evolution, rather, it is a consequence of the specific circumstances of evolution on Earth, which frequently made greater complexity advantageous, and thus naturally selected for. Depending on the situation, organisms' complexity can either increase, decrease, or stay the same, and all three of these trends have been observed in evolution. Creationist sources frequently define evolution according to a colloquial, rather than scientific, meaning. As a result, many attempts to rebut evolution do not address the findings of evolutionary biology. This also means that advocates of creationism and evolutionary biologists often simply speak past each other. Scientific acceptance. Recent objections to evolutionary theory have focused on its scientific validity, or attempting to come up with alternative ideas such as creationism to debate its findings. Status as a theory. Critics of evolution frequently assert that evolution is just a theory, with the intent of emphasizing that scientific theories are never absolute, or of characterizing it as a matter of opinion rather than of fact or evidence. This reflects a misunderstanding of the meaning of theory in a scientific context, whereas in colloquial speech a theory is a conjecture or guess. In science, a theory is an explanation whose predictions have been verified by experiments or other evidence. Evolutionary theory refers to an explanation for the diversity of species and their ancestry which has met extremely high standards of scientific evidence. An example of evolutionist theory is the modern synthesis of Darwinian natural selection and Mendelian inheritance. As with any scientific theory, the modern synthesis is constantly debated, tested, and refined by scientists. But there is an overwhelming consensus in the scientific community that it remains the only robust model that accounts for the known facts concerning evolution. Critics also state that evolution is not a fact. In science, a fact is a verified empirical observation. In colloquial contexts, however, a fact can simply refer to anything for which there is overwhelming evidence. For example, in common usage theories such as the Earth revolves around the Sun, and objects fall due to gravity, may be referred to as facts, even though they are purely theoretical. From a scientific standpoint, therefore, evolution may be called a fact, for the same reason that gravity can. Under the scientific definition, evolution is an observable process that occurs whenever a population of organisms genetically changes over time. Under the colloquial definition, the theory of evolution can also be called a fact, referring to this theory's well-established nature. Thus, evolution is widely considered both a theory and a fact by scientists. Similar confusion is involved in objections that evolution is unproven, since no theory in science is known to be absolutely true, only verified by empirical evidence. This distinction is an important one in philosophy of science, as it relates to the lack of absolute certainty in all empirical claims, not just evolution. Strict proof is possible only in formal sciences such as logic and mathematics, not natural sciences. Thus, to say that evolution is not proven is trivially true, but no more an indictment of evolution than calling it a theory. The confusion arises, however, in that the colloquial meaning of proof is simply compelling evidence, in which case scientists would indeed consider evolution proven. Degree of acceptance and objection is often made in the teaching of evolution that evolution is controversial or contentious. Unlike past creationist arguments which sought to abolish the teaching of evolution altogether, this argument makes the weaker claim that evolution, being controversial, should be presented alongside alternative views, and students should be allowed to evaluate and choose between the options on their own. This objection forms the basis of the Teach the Controversy campaign by the Discovery Institute, a think tank based in Seattle, Washington, to promote the teaching of intelligent design in U.S. public schools. This goal was a part of the Institute's wedge strategy, an attempt to gradually undermine evolution and ultimately to reverse the stifling dominance of the materialist worldview, and to replace it with a science consonant with Christian and theistic convictions. Several subsequent attempts were made to insert intelligent design or creationism into the U.S. public school curriculum, including the failed Santorum Amendment in 2001. Scientists and U.S. courts have rejected this objection on the grounds that science is not based on appeals to popularity, but on evidence. The scientific consensus of biologists, not popular opinion or fairness, determines what is considered acceptable science. And although evolution is controversial in the public arena, it is entirely uncontroversial among experts in the field. In response, creationists have disputed the level of scientific support for evolution. The Discovery Institute has gathered over 600 scientists since 2001 to sign a scientific dissent from Darwinism in order to show that there are a number of scientists who dispute what they refer to as Darwinian evolution. This statement did not profess outright disbelief in evolution, but expressed skepticism as to the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Several Counter-petitions have been launched in turn, including a scientific support for Darwinism, which gathered over 7,000 signatures in 4 days, and Project Steve, a tongue-in-cheek petition that has gathered the signatures of 1,290 evolution-supporting scientists named Steve. Creationists have argued for over a century that evolution is a theory in crisis, that will soon be overturned, based on objections that it lacks reliable evidence or violates natural laws. These objections have been rejected by most scientists, as have claims that intelligent design, or any other creationist explanation, meets the basic scientific standards that would be required to make them scientific alternatives to evolution. It is also argued that even if evidence against evolution exists, it is a false dilemma to characterize this as evidence for intelligent design. A similar objection to evolution is that certain scientific authorities, mainly pre-modern ones, have doubted or rejected evolution. Most commonly, it is argued that Darwin recanted, on his deathbed, a false anecdote originating from Lady Hope's story. These objections are generally rejected as appeals to authority.